Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual talk, Witness at Sand Creek, The Life and Letters of Silas Soule with Reverend Dr. Nancy Nero. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose connections to the land continue today and into the future. For those joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories program. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. I do hope you will check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. And with that, please allow me to invite up our speaker. Reverend Dr. Nancy Nero graduated with her Doctor of Ministry degree in May 2023 from Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and is ordained in the United Church of Christ. She had a 15-year career in hospice and hospital chaplaincy bereavement and created grief work as an important companion with racial justice work. Prior to her call to ministry, she was a historic preservationist, one of the many reasons we're so excited to have her talk today, and a journalist. Reverend Dr. Nero lives on the ancestral land of Squaxin Island people of the water, who live near the shores and watersheds of the 7 southernmost inlets of the Salish Sea, near what is known today as Puget Sound in Washington. And we are just so excited to have you with us today. Take it away, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kyle. It is absolutely such a joy to be here. And thank you to Abby and Lauren at the Congregational Library and Archives for bringing us together today. I'm very grateful to all of you to be here. Before I begin, I too would like to read my land acknowledgement from the book. This book was written in Denver, Colorado, on land that was traveled by the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho indigenous peoples for centuries. I acknowledge this land, this place is the ancestral home where the people hunted and traveled. It is important for me to acknowledge the land as a white woman of European descent, an elder, Christian pastor, and descendant of Ellis Island immigrants to honor the original inhabitants. As an activist, I pledge myself to the work of disrupting systems of oppression that led to the disposition of indigenous people from the land and that have continued to deny their rights to self-determination. The Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho people are not a people of the past. They are a people of the present. My book is a collection of 25 letters written by Kansas abolitionist Silas Soule between 1860 and 1865. He writes from snowy Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, from Boston, where he met Walt Whitman, from the gold fields of Gilpin County in the Colorado Territory, from Fort Union and Fort Craig in New Mexico, in the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado at Fort Garland, and finally at Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. Silas witnessed the Sand Creek Massacre in November 1864, and these letters, words, and storytelling that I'll be talking about today are reflections of his letters. I do want you to know, too, that I'll be reading 3 letters from his collection, the last 3 letters, and these are hard to hear and hard to speak. So please take care of yourself as you need to. Truth-telling about the massacre includes hearing these words that help continue the work of accountability, lament, healing, and maybe even hope. I've discovered over the years that if people only know of Silas Soule through his disobedience at the Sand Creek Massacre in November 1864, they may be shocked and even surprised by this young man a Maine native who then watched the massacre by traveling through it and then wrote a letter to a friend colleague about the murders and mutilation he witnessed. When you discover, as I have, that his entire life was someone who stood up, showed up, and spoke up for justice way before the Sand Creek Massacre, you understand that he led a life of moral courage, a reminder that I feel is more important to share today more than ever. When I introduce Silas, I usually start with the 18-year-old who was living in Lawrence, Kansas with his family in 1859. He already was an abolitionist, following in his parents' footsteps. His family home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, as well as his Congregationalist pastor's home as well. He had been welcomed into a small, tight brotherhood of men who were escorting formerly enslaved people to freedom. He traveled with abolitionist John Brown. His first letter in the collection was to his friend, neighbor, and fellow abolitionist, George Cutter, and he wrote in code about his work in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which was that he was about to break out two of John Brown raiders who had escaped in 1859 following the Harper's Ferry raid and had been captured, Albert Hazlitt and Aaron Stevens. I've discovered that abolitionist work was about trust, keeping secrets, and showing up sometimes in a moment's notice. It was a very tight group of devoted friends putting their lives in danger for freedom for formerly enslaved people. Today, I would call that justice in action. The attempt to break out Hazlitt and Stevens failed because of a February snowstorm in West Virginia that would have made tracking by authorities very easy. And these two abolitionists were executed in late February. The failed attempt brought him to Boston in March, where he met other abolitionists and poet Walt Whitman and attended a memorial service in Boston for Hazlitt and Stevens. Prior to his call to West Virginia and Massachusetts, Silas had already helped break out Kansas Underground Railroad conductor Dr. John Doy from a St. Louis jail with these same abolitionists who worked to save Hazlitt and Stevens. Upon his return to Lawrence, he quickly left again, this time to the Colorado goldfields, settled in Gilpin County as a miner and blacksmith, and then enlisted in the American Civil War a year later in December 1861, where he found a new community of men, fellow soldiers. He fought against Confederates in March 1862 at the Battle of Glorieta Pass with Joe Kramer, Ned Wynkoop, and Samuel Tappan, all who would ultimately challenge what happens at the Big Sandy Creek, some by disobeying orders, some who will be witnesses at the congressional inquiry, and one who will serve as the president of the inquiry. But in those heyday days of the Great March from Denver to New Mexico, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Red, White, and Blue, he's forming this tight bond of friendship again, this time with soldiers who also believe in a cause. In these letters, we read of his longing to get home. We read of his hope for a wife. We read of the assurance he gives his mom to not worry. But you know, mothers worry. He becomes a recruiting officer traveling to Fort Garland in southern Colorado in the winter and spring of 1864, and then was assigned to Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado Territory, again under the command of Colonel John Shivington, a Methodist minister. This is where Ned and Silas meet with Southern Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle, who speaks of wanting peace with the soldiers. That first conversation and the exchange of white people who had been taken as prisoners begins all efforts to find peace on the plains in the summer of 1864. Ned and Silas escort Black Kettle and other Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs to Camp Weld in Denver for a peace council, and nothing seems to be approved. On the way back home, a plan is put in place by Ned. And as I write in the book, it's called, really, my understanding is peace. Peace as food, peace as protection, peace as kindness, peace as welcoming, and most importantly, probably, peace as promise. Peace did not last long. Shivington arrived under the cover of darkness with a regiment of 600 poorly trained new recruits with no experienced soldiers, with the endorsement of Colorado John Evans, also a Methodist, at Fort Lyon on November 27, 1864. Silas was told the next day of the massacre plans and said he would disobey orders and tried to stop the massacre from happening. He would later write to Ned in the letter that forced a congressional inquiry that I'll be reading in just a moment, that as soon as I knew of their movement, I was indignant, as you would have been were you there. Silas wrote in that letter that the massacre lasted 6 to 8 hours. National Park Service interpreters say that he traveled back and forth across the Big Sandy Creek, witnessing soldiers murdering 230 elders, women, and children. He writes in intimate details of these murders and the mutilation of these bodies by the Colorado soldiers who took the body parts back to Denver as trophies. And here is the letter that he wrote to Ned Wynkoop, dated December 14th, 1864. Dear Ned, 2 days after you left here, the 3rd Regiment with a battalion of the 1st arrived here, having moved so secretly that we were not aware of their approach until they had pickets around the post, allowing no one to pass out. They arrested Captain Bent and John Vogel and placed guards around their houses. They then declared their intention to massacre the friendly Indians camped on Sand Creek. Major Anthony gave all information and eagerly joined in with Shivington and company and ordered Lieutenant Kramer with his whole company to join the command. As soon as I knew of their movement, I was indignant, as you would have been were you here, and went to Cannon's room, where a number of officers of the 1st and 3rd were congregated, and told them that any man who would take part in the murders, knowing the circumstances as we did, was a low-lived, cowardly son of a bitch. Captain J.J. Johnson and Lieutenant Harding went to camp and reported to Shiv, Downing, and the whole outfit what I had said, and you can bet hell was to pay in camp. Shiv and all hands swore they would hang me before they moved camp, but I stuck it out, and all the officers at the post, except Anthony, backed me. I was then ordered with my whole company to Major A with 20 days' rations. I told them I would not take part in their intended murder, but if they were going after the Sioux, Kiowas, or any fighting Indians, I would go as far as any of them. They said that was what they were going for, and I joined them. We arrived at Black Kettle and Left Hand's camp at daylight. Lieutenant Wilson and companies C, E, and G were ordered in advance to cut off their herd. He made a circle to the rear and formed a line 200 yards from the village and opened fire. Poor old John Smith and Louderback ran out with white flags, but they paid no attention to them, and they ran back to their tents. Anthony then rushed up with companies D, K, and G to within 100 yards and commenced firing. I refused to fire and swore that none but a coward would, for by this time hundreds of women and children were coming toward us and getting on their knees for mercy. Anthony shouted, "Kill the sons of bitches." Smith and Louderback came to our command, although I am confident there were 200 shots fired at them. For I heard an officer say that old Smith and anyone who sympathized with the Indians ought to be killed, and now was a good time to do it. The battery then came up in our rear and opened on them. I took my company across the creek, and by this time the whole of the 3rd and the batteries were firing into them, and you can form some idea of the slaughter. When the Indians found there was no hope for them, they went for the creek and got under the banks, and some of the bucks got their bows and a few rifles and defended themselves as well as they could. By this time, there was no organization among our troops. They were a perfect mob, every man on his own hook. My company was the only one that kept their formation, and we did not fire a shot. The massacre lasted 6 or 8 hours, and a good many Indians escaped. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded, and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her. She held her hands and arms up to defend her, and he cut one arm off and held the other with one hand and dashed the hatchet through her brain. One squaw with her 2 children were on their knees begging for their lives of a dozen soldiers within 10 feet of them all, firing, when one succeeded in hitting the squaw in the thigh, when she took a knife and cut the throats of both children and then killed herself. One old squaw hung herself in the lodge. There was not enough room for her to hang, and she held up her knees and choked herself to death. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. I saw 2 Indians hold up one of another's hands, chased until they were exhausted, when they kneeled down and clasped each other around the neck, and both were shot together. They were all scalped, and as high as half a dozen taken from one head. They were all horribly mutilated. One woman was cut open and a child taken out of her and scalped. White Antelope, War Bonnet, and a number of others had ears and privates cut off. Squaws' snatches were cut out for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. But every word I have told you is the truth, which they do not deny. It was almost impossible to save any of them. Charlie Otterby saved John Smith and Windsor's squaw. I saved little Charlie Bent. George Bent was killed. Jack Smith was taken prisoner and murdered the next day in his tent by one of Dunn's Company E. I understand the man received a horse for doing the job. They were going to murder Charlie Bent, but I run him into the fort. They were going to kill old Uncle John Smith, but Lieutenant Cannon and the boys of Fort Lyon interfered and saved him. They would have murdered old Bent's family if Colonel Tappan had not taken the matter in hand. Kramer went up with 20 men, and they did not like to buck against so many of the first. Shivington has gone to Washington to be made general, I suppose, and get authority to raise a 9-month regiment to hunt Indians. He said Downing will have me cashiered if possible. If they do, I want you to help me. I think they will try the same for Kramer, for he has shot his mouth off a good deal and did not shoot his pistol off in the massacre. Joe has behaved first rate during this whole affair. Shivington reports 500 or 600 killed, but there were not more than 200, about 140 women and children, and 60 bucks. A good many were out hunting buffalo. Our best Indians were killed: Black Kettle, One Eye, Minamick, and Left Hand. George Pierce of Company F was killed trying to save John Smith. There was one other of the first killed and 9 of the third, all through their own fault. They would get up to the edge of the bank and look over to get a shot at an Indian under them. When the women were killed, the bucks did not seem to try and get away, but fought desperately. Charlie Otterby wished me to write all about it to you. He says he would have given anything if you could have been here. I suppose Kramer has written to you all the particulars, so I will write half. Your family is well. Bill Worker, Colonel Tappan, and Wilson, who was wounded in the arm, start for Denver in the morning. There's not news I can think of. I expect we will have a hell of a time with Indians this winter. We have 200 men at the post. Anthony in command. I think he will be dismissed when the facts are known in Washington. Give my regards to any friends you come across and write as soon as possible. Yours, SS. Signed, SS Soule. 4 days later, Silas wrote to his mom, Sophia, in Lawrence, Kansas. December 18th, 1864, Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory. Dear Mother, I received a letter from you tonight, and you bet I was glad to hear from you. I ought to write oftener, but I am so lazy and I have so little that would interest you that I neglect to write. I wrote to Annie and sent the letter by Mr. Gould, who belongs in Brunswick, and I believe he was served 3 years in my regiment, is going to Bath. You will see him, and he will tell you everything you want to know. I've not received any letter from Will since he left Lawrence. I think I will write to him in the morning, although I don't believe he will receive it. The mails are so irregular. I receive letters from Annie and Em quite often and endeavor to answer them as soon as possible. I still have hopes of going to Maine this winter, but may not until spring. We've had considerable trouble with Indians this fall. The day you wrote, I was present at a massacre of 300 Indians, mostly women and children. It was a horrible scene, and I would not let my company fire. They were friendly, and some of our soldiers were in their camp and at the time trading. It looked too hard for me to see little children on their knees begging for their lives, have their brains beat out like dogs. It was a regiment of 100 days men who accomplished the noble deed. Some of the Indians fought when they saw no chance of escape and killed 12 and wounded 40 of our men. I had one horse shot. I've been an Indian scout for the last 3 weeks, but don't think we'll have much more at present. Tell Annie and Em that I am just beginning to receive papers from them, for which I am very grateful. Give my love to everybody and tell them that I would be glad to hear from them. I do not write near as often as I used to, for I have so much to do to keep my company papers correct. I'm responsible for $50,000 worth of government property, which must be attended to. I will write occasionally. Don't get worried, for there is not the least danger in the world of me getting killed. And as I am the most interested party, you should not fret. I believe I will write a letter to Uncle Ben. Good night, your Sonny, Silas. And the last letter in this collection of 25 letters was written on January 8th, 1865, again to his mom, Sophia. Dear Mother, I suppose you are anxious to hear from me. I should have written oftener if I had not been so busy fixing up my papers. Our regiment has been mustered out, 3 years having expired, and all the officers are relieved from duty at this point. And I, amongst the rest, want to get my papers all square, so if I go out, I can start for the States right off. But the officers think I will be retained in the Veterans Organization. At any rate, I can, if I wish, and I have been thinking the matter over, and believe it is for the best. For if I go back, I don't know of anything I could do that would pay, for I am too lazy to work, you well know. The only chance would be to marry a rich widow. Do you think there is a good chance in Maine, or will I find richer ones out west? I had applied for a leave of absence to go to Maine and just received answer from it saying that our regiment was to be immediately reorganized. So I will have to wait and may not see you before March. I suppose you have seen Mr. Gould. I sent a letter by him. He will tell you all about killing Indians. I spent New Year's Day on the battleground counting dead Indians. There were not as many killed as was reported. There was not more than 130 killed, but most of them were women and children, and all of them scalped. I hope the authorities at Washington will investigate the killing of those Indians. I think they will be apt to hoist some of our officials. I would not fire on the Indians with my company, and the colonel said he would have me cashiered, but he is out of the service before me, and I think I stand better than he does in regard to his great Indian fight. I'm reforming in regard to my bad habits, Mother, for I have left off chewing tobacco and smoking a pipe, but I will smoke cigars when I can get them. I don't drink, so you see I'm getting quite respectable and will stand a chance of getting a wife when I go down east. I'm going to write to Will this evening. I've not written since he went south. I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Wish I could send you a present, but our paymaster died Christmas and we have no pay for 4 months. I am almost broke. Your affectionate son, Sile. John Shivington left military service by the time Silas was the first witness at the congressional inquiry when it started in February 1865. And he gave testimony for 6 days. He did get married on April 1st to Hersa Coberly. His life was repeatedly threatened for speaking truth to power. After being mustered out of service in January, after serving for 3 years, Silas became deputy marshal in Denver. In the evening of April 23rd, 1865, he raced out of the house when he heard shots fired. When he arrived at 15th and Arapahoe, he was assassinated in the middle of the street. The assassin was never held accountable. John Shivington was never held accountable. This child of abolitionists from New England, this Congregationalist son of Maine, is buried in the Grand Army of the Republic block at Riverside Cemetery in Denver. Surrounded by veterans from all eras of military conflict, their final resting place marked with a marble headstone. My great curiosity about Silas has been, how did he become who he became? And the answers for me are that he had New England-raised literate parents who were Congregationalists, and his parents' community of abolitionists and their collective quest for justice. Maine natives Amasa and Sophia Soule, born in Bath and Bangor, lived in Chelsea, Massachusetts when she read Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe from a published series in the Boston newspapers to her children in their parlor. This act of weaving storytelling with justice inspired Amasa to join other New England abolitionists to move to Lawrence in 1854. Even knowing that his own congregational pastor's home was a stop on the Underground Railroad in Lawrence must have anchored his connections to faith, community, and justice. He wasn't perfect, but he leaves behind in his letters a life grounded in family, carving out community wherever he went, knowing right from wrong and choosing right. He had a moral compass that pointed him in the direction of justice, of always choosing right. I've been traveling with Silas now for 30 years, discovering his story on my first day as a new employee on the new employee tour at the Colorado History Museum in Denver. His portrait was hanging in the basement exhibits, and I asked who he was, knowing then that this was a soldier in the American Civil War. Later, I discovered where he was buried in 2002 while working as a historic preservationist at Denver's oldest cemeteries, and shared the good news with my friend Susie Aikman, a Cherokee woman and Native American music host in Denver on Kuvo Radio, who then shared it with the Sand Creek Massacre descendants she knew. I wrote a biography, a theological construction, a social justice play, and performed the play all about Silas in 4 independent studies while at Iliff School of Theology. I wrote my dissertation in part around his 19th century activism of showing up, standing up, and speaking up for justice, and graduated in 2023 from Phillips Theological Seminary. As I was finishing this book, I wondered about his moral injury, the wounds that Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock writes about in Soul Repair, recovering from moral injury after war. She writes that moral injury results when soldiers violate their core moral beliefs, and in evaluating their behavior negatively, they feel they no longer live in a reliable, meaningful world and can no longer be regarded as decent human beings. Dr. Brock helped me to see that Silas tried to right the wrong in his letters. In his testimony, even in his disobedience, he was present as a witness to horrific violence perpetuated by fellow soldiers wearing the same uniform as his. I read Silas's last 3 letters that I read to you this morning to Dr. Brock to understand what kind of moral injury he sustained. And she said that he knew what was going to happen was wrong, but not being able to stop it because he failed to prevent it is a sense of moral responsibility. She said that his determination to write these letters is that Silas was willing to take a risk, to make it known, a sense of moral outrage. I've learned a lot since this book came out a year ago. At my first book reading and signing, a former Vietnam veteran came up to the table with his book for me to sign and looked me in the eyes and came closer to me and said, "Thank you for writing about a soldier who disobeyed orders." I said, "You're welcome." I've been moved by how people have been moved by Silas. The last 30 years have been a lot of writing alone, so to have his story and stories of other militaries serving and disobeying orders that has become inspiring to others really does warm my heart. In November, 6 lawmaker veterans in the U.S. Congress issued a video urging U.S. service members to refuse illegal orders. I sent one of those veterans, Representative Jason Crow from Colorado, a copy of the book, One Colorado Soldier from the 19th Century to a Colorado Soldier who served in 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. Silas's act of disobedience and not allowing those in his command to shoot saved Cheyenne and Arapaho lives, say Sand Creek Massacre descendants at the annual spiritual healing run that happens every year in a run from the massacre site near Eads, Colorado, to Denver with a stop at Silas's grave. In a ceremony where cedar and sweetgrass are burned, where drummers sing a veteran's song, and where Silas's letter is read by his great-great-nephew, gratitude is part of the gathering. Sand Creek Massacre descendant Otto Braided Hair describes this ongoing work of gathering together, joining in rituals and ceremonies together as reconciliation. Finally, I'd like to come to the end of my time here and make room for questions and answers with this. Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, former dean at the Episcopalian Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and currently a visiting professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School, wrote an article last year in the Christian Century titled, "What History Are We Making?" She asks, what history will we make, not only in the stories we tell, but in those we live? What history will we leave behind? She suggested we cultivate a moral imaginary, the capacity to see beyond what is and aspire toward what could be. She writes, this means teaching truth even when it unsettles us, embracing accountability, and acting with moral courage in our various communities. Essentially, she says, it means planting seeds of justice and truth in the stories we live and tell our children, as well as in public life. We cannot undo what has been made, but we can choose how to make it over. Every act of truth-telling, every refusal of silence, every step toward justice makes history and moves us closer to a more moral future. So today I invite you to find your moral compass that may be buried or hidden away in a make-believe drawer, to dust it off and see beyond what is and join me in aspiring toward what could be when we are pointed in the direction of justice. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I'm thinking about that last part, that idea of the moral imaginary. And I think one of the things that might be striking for folks is the way in which the call to justice in one realm expands us to see the call to justice in many realms, right? That you give us Soule, who is raised as an abolitionist, yet here, and while the work he's doing is under the Civil War, here he's not dealing with enslavers, he's dealing with indigenous people. And do you find that there's kind of, that this is, I think, that there is this way that one seed grows into a much larger ability to kind of see the world? Is that what you might see is going on with Soule?
Thank you, Kyle. I feel that while he is an abolitionist, he's fighting the system of enslavement. And when he is disobeying orders at Sand Creek, he is also challenging the system of the military. That 600 men did not disobey orders that day. So the systems that are in place of oppression, of marginalizing communities of people of color is part of a thread that I continue to pull apart around how he challenges today, as we are readers of these letters and readers of his story, how he challenges us to also become a witness in our own lives. And I make that really clear in the book that, here's this amazing video that came out in November, and we have this in-person connection to this 19th century abolitionist disobeyer of military orders who we can see through a lens in the 21st century through this video. And that makes us think, well, how am I being challenged? Where is Silas's story in me? And how do I be a witness in my world? And I think these threads can be pulled apart in lots of different ways. I continue to pull them apart myself, but how we can, be reflective of how he did his, I think, call to be present in the world of justice, finding his way to navigate into communities of justice, particularly with those Kansas abolitionists. I think he was the youngest one in the group. How do we welcome? How do we be part of collaborations with each other? How do we open the doors to do kind of the work that he kind of sets us as an example today? So there's lots of different threads to be pulled around how we make connections to his world and our world today. That doesn't sometimes feel very, very far from each other, but on the calendars, of course, it really is.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about what you've done in this work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
That you're always, that the past is not hermetically sealed.
That's correct.
Past is not something that just happened then, that has nothing to tell us about today, but also that by a similar way is also not something that we can not respond to, right? That's
Absolutely
kind of there. And maybe you could talk a little bit about pilgrimage.
I was just thinking about that because there's another thread there. I used to call that racial justice pilgrimages is the back third of the book. There was a time when I was writing this letter that was not in my book proposal, but it became very clear to me that I needed to go to the places that he wrote letters to, right? He did to everyone but Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That may still be, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania may still be calling to me. But, and not only did I want to go to these places, but my big connection to these places, this land, these lands, was that I wanted to talk with people who are today's historical interpreters, who are museum directors, who are authors, who are historians, and interview them as part of the book. But then it became very clear that I had to go to them and go to their places where they are. And I stood at Fort Garland on the parade ground where I knew Silas had been. And it was so incredibly moving to me to know that, somewhere here in this landscape, he slept here. He had connection here. He had friends and colleagues who he was connected with, and he walked this parade ground. And it was, how do we put ourselves in places where we can, from a racial justice perspective, go to and be changed by, because that's what pilgrimage does. We go on a pilgrimage. We invite change. We want to be changed by the time we come back. And to me, it seemed like, as I did this myself, that the invitation was like, this is a way that we can grow deeper in our own awareness of injustice in history by being in places where injustice happened. I write in the book that in Santa Fe, there's a rock with an inscription on it that says below is the site of the Japanese internment camp here in Santa Fe, where 4,000 Japanese American men were imprisoned. And there's nothing else in Santa Fe that would reflect this is the place. And even I was stunned, and I was shocked and surprised by just this like casualness around how we write about that particular history in New Mexico with this rock in a dog park of all things, and how we can be changed from that to really become more involved and more and not silent and speaking out. And how do we find voice in all of that is to go on a pilgrimage. So yeah.
Well, and speaking of places that you've been and of histories of those places and how, so there's a great question here from Ronald Fujiyoshi, who says, has your connection with Tulsa, Oklahoma? And I think when I was, as I think about Ronald's question, I also think about the massacre in Tulsa.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. Really recovered into the last couple of decades.
That's correct. That's correct. And actually, preservation related to that as well, and oral histories of survivors are all part of that Tulsa Race Massacre. And how do we speak of these events of violence and death, and how do we continue to find voice in them to understand today how we are connected to them? Not just the Sand Creek Massacre, but not just Tulsa, but we kind of Wounded Knee comes up a lot in my conversations. Washita, where Black Kettle ultimately was killed. These places that we can go to today to be changed, to understand deeper of injustice in our past, and be accountable to that. That's a big part of what my dissertation was about. Like, how do we be accountable to this in our present about the past to really work towards a future of hope and healing? If we're not accountable, if we're not speaking of it, if we're not going to it and telling whatever in the context of whatever our communities are, then we are not doing the reconciliation work that Auto Braided Hair really is inviting us all to do together.
You mentioned, I think, early on about book clubs. I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about, so there may well be folks on here listening today who would love to do a book club around this. So I'm interested both, like, how would you like to see this kind of read in a book club? And then maybe share a little bit about, are there things that you're hearing from those experiences that were things you didn't even anticipate?
Yes, thank you. I've done probably 25 or 30 book clubs on Zoom. And so I've been able to be around the country, all over the place. And there's not a traditional format, but what seems to be the flow that most book study groups are, that have been mostly in congregations of justice, and a lot of them United Methodist Church congregations as well, did the deepest desire to understand and confront this Methodist minister, John Shivington, and the accountability of what that means. But so people have been like they'll meet for 4 or 5 times. I do have a book study guide for faith communities who would like to get an extra bit of input from questions and pointing people towards direction. And then I usually pop in at the last Zoom and available for questions. However, any community wants to engage with me. I love being in conversation with folks, and many of those may even be with us today who have been on a book study with me. We did a book study earlier this year with a Methodist congregation in Minnesota, and the violence was still very fresh. The murders were very fresh, and we talked a tremendous amount of what protest looks like, which disobeying orders is a protest, if we wanted to look at it that way in our 21st century vision, looking back at him. But like, how do we be a witness to our own world, really was one of the bigger conversations out of that gathering. Like, this says so much about who we are. How do we show up? How do we show up for others? How do we be a witness to what's happening? And how do we make sure that we're not silent? And I was so grateful for that takeaway with people who in Minnesota were living a life that only we could watch and be pained by, but comforting them. And this was it looked like to me, really a healing moment to be able to hear this story, talk about this story, and be able to find themselves in his story.
Is there ever a challenge in this narrative of setting up the kind of congregational descended Soule as the hero and the Methodist Chivington as the enemy, the antagonist? And I say this, as something that, how do we hit the middle ground between overly triumphalist on one side and overly castigatory on the other? Has that come up? How do faith communities today think about when they're on the right and wrong side of history?
Well, let me just quickly say that the United Methodist Church and collectively, I've been involved with doing a lot of lectures around the country, from Washington, D.C. in their justice offices to book groups in Denver, are doing incredible work about the accountability of what having John Chivington as a Methodist minister as part of their history and storytelling, and their commitment to working with descendants like Otto Braided Hair, who are carving out new collaborations, new ways of being in the 21st century to continue to be accountable to that history. I think it's incredible what they've been committed to today. But Kyle, I really think so often lately that this is really an ecumenical conversation. It's not just Methodists, it's not just Congregationalists, it's not like Anne Braden, in the 1860s, Episcopalian. It's not like the freedom fighters who went to the South. It's really this ecumenical people of faith who are connected through this storytelling. That how do we tell the story through that lens, as it's all of our responsibilities. John Chivington, I need to be accountable to John Chivington's actions. We all need to find our way to navigate a place where we can name that as an invitation to do the kind of work that we want to do around healing and hope and lamenting together across the board. Every denomination has a story that historical injustice past, that if anything is the invitation to talk about that rather than sweep it under the rug. We don't do that very well in the UCC, quite honestly, from my own experience, nationally as well as collectively. But if we all did that, we would see through a lot of injustice that we just don't name as our past, but really is part of our present that we continue to need to heal from and with.
Wonderful answer. Great question here from Galia Williams, who says, thank you for this sad but necessary conversation. Any advice on how to teach this difficult history to younger generations?
I think about that a lot. I think those of us who are bearing witness to families who are raising children in this time, I think so much of the core places of how do we help our kids know what is right from wrong. And those are, aside from Silas, aside from his mom and dad, Sophia and Amasa, who taught their children these values, I think in the day and age, I hear so much about how do we help our kids always know what is right and make good choices that always reflect what is right for themselves, but also the people they're around and the communities where they travel in. And how to see injustice when it happens. And it does. It will. It always will. In our childhoods, we can think back at the times where I saw as a white person, injustice happening as a teenager. So if we're not talking about those good choices, I know a lot of parents of teenagers, particularly right now, are helping their kids to make those right choices. Those good choices also include choosing right, no matter what the circumstances. And that's very hard for kiddos, for parents, to kind of be able to foster that kind of good conversation and good places of helping them become better human beings, really, is what it does. That's
Well,
hard work.
yes. Wonderful comment here from Anna Swingren, one of our great supporters of the CLA. She writes that she first learned of the Sand Creek Massacre in Michener's book, Centennial. And she thanks you for sharing this historical account at a time when we need soldiers to remember their humanity first.
Thank you.
And what do you see, maybe as kind of final question, somebody, you're talking to somebody who is now doing their own graduate program work. What's the next history we need? That yours is in a line of history. What would you like to see maybe kind of come out of this, or doesn't have to be directly out of this, it could be related.
Right. Well, a big part of my thinking and discerning for many years now has been how to be honest about racial injustice in our own faith communities and our own national settings of denominational work. And even seeing where today, the repatriation of human remains is still a big conversation at the Vatican. There are places where, and in fact, that's a big conversation in my book too. I end the book in my epilogue of how do we, if you have any of these human remains in your homes, it is time to return them. And not just, human remains, but also belongings that were stolen from people who had just been murdered on the plains of the prairie by U.S. soldiers. There is a feeling that, these conversations around Indigenous people and this repatriation in the last few years at Carlisle, how we return children to their Indigenous homes and their descendants. These are big conversations that come out of a book like this. But I've kind of always been, and that was part of my, how do we continue to find the language to speak of all of this in ways, in congregations and sanctuaries, in day-to-day congregational life? How do we kind of have a grounding, a rootedness in understanding how racial justice is Jesus. Jesus is racial justice. When we preach on one, we're preaching with the other. How do we find ways to continue to dismantle white silence in our churches, where racism and racial justice still are not parts of the everyday lexicon of how we want to be in the world, in our four walls inside, but also how do we really want to be the hands and feet outside the four walls around this particular place of racial justice in the world today, I think is something that I continue to sit with.
I think I speak for many of us on today that we also
I know.
need to sit with this, will be sitting with this, and very much appreciate you contributing.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kyle, for inviting me today. This has just been a joy.
And thank you all so much for joining us. We will see you at the next Congregational Library and Archives program. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks again, Kyle. Take care now.